I was in 7th grade when this happened. My best friend, Ethan, and I were excited for our end-of-the-year field trip to the Ripley's Aquarium of the Smokies. We lived in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a literal mountain town surrounded by rolling hills and forests as far as the eye could see. Our science teacher, Mr. Russo, was assigned as our group's chaperone for the trip. He was one of those laid-back teachers who joked around with kids and never took much seriously. While other chaperones barked orders and stuck close to their groups like glue, Mr. Russo's supervision basically consisted of glancing around every few minutes and trusting we'd stay out of trouble. At first, we thought that was great, but looking back, that's probably the only reason Ethan and I managed to wander off so easily. When our group arrived, the aquarium felt like it was ours alone. There were no crowds, no other guests, just our classes slowly filing through the echoing halls. Ethan and I didn't want to shuffle along behind a bunch of chatty classmates. We were eager to see the tanks up close without anyone blocking our view. So, while everyone else gathered in the lobby, we quietly slipped away into the first exhibit area. It felt amazing at first, walking alone through the winding halls bathed in soft blue light from the massive tanks. We pressed our faces to the glass, watching stingrays glide past and clownfish dart between anemones. We laughed about Finding Nemo, pointing out the dory fish and making bad jokes about the sharks. For a while, it was perfect. Then, we heard someone behind us. "Hey, you two." The voice was sharp, commanding, enough to freeze us mid-laugh. We turned and saw a man standing there. He didn't wear an aquarium uniform, but he looked official enough at first glance. Late 30s, average build, cargo shorts, and a green t-shirt. He had short-cropped hair and carried himself like he worked there. "Are you two with the school group?" he asked. I hesitated, my mouth half open to say no, hoping to avoid trouble, but Ethan, quicker on his feet, blurted out, "Yeah, come with me," the man said. Right now, we exchanged nervous glances, assuming we'd been caught sneaking off. Neither of us wanted to get suspended over a field trip. So, like the scared 7th graders we followed him. At first, we expected him to lead us back to the lobby, but instead, he took us through a series of narrow, dimly lit hallways. The air grew colder as we passed unmarked doors and the glowing exit signs hanging from the ceiling. I felt uneasy, but kept telling myself he probably knew a shortcut. We passed the restrooms, then reached a heavy metal door at the end of the hall. The man pushed it open and let us outside. It was a back area by the woods, gravel beneath our feet, dumpsters to one side, and no other people in sight. Finally, I worked up the courage to ask, "Do you, work here? Where are we going?" "Yes," he said curtly. "We'll drive around to the front entrance. That's the only way you can get back in." The explanation made little sense, but panic bubbled in my chest, and I didn't question it out loud. Ethan and I followed him to a parked car, a faded blue sedan with peeling paint. "Get in the back," he ordered. We slid into the back seat without protest, too scared of being in trouble to think clearly. "Buckle up," he said, starting the engine. At first, it seemed like he might actually drive us back to the front. But then, he turned left, away from the aquarium. "Where are you going?" Ethan and I asked at the same time. The man didn't answer. Instead, we heard the click of the back door locks engaging. His voice dropped to a chilling tone. "If either of you tries anything, I'll kill you." My stomach dropped as he reached into the glove box and pulled out a large knife. He held it for just a moment before slipping it back inside, but the message was clear. Ethan and I sat frozen, our breath shallow, unable to look at each other without drawing attention. The man kept glancing at us in the rearview mirror every few seconds as he drove uphill through an isolated wooded neighborhood. No houses, no cars, just endless trees. Finally, he pulled off to the side of the road in what felt like the middle of nowhere. "Stay in the car," he barked as he got out, knife in hand. I whispered to Ethan, "Be ready to run the second I say." The man came to my door, yanked it open, and growled, "Get out, and tell your little friend here, if he wants you alive, he better stay in the car." The world tilted under me as he grabbed my arm and began leading me toward the woods. I saw Ethan inching across the back seat toward my open door, his eyes locked on mine. "Run!" I screamed. Ethan bolted downhill, his sneakers pounding the asphalt. Adrenaline surged through me as I twisted out of the man's grip and sprinted after him. Behind me, I heard the man roar in frustration, then the sharp whoosh of something flying past my ear. Clang! A metallic sound echoed as his knife hit the ground just ahead of me. I didn't stop to look. I didn't dare. I tore down the hill, lungs burning, praying he wouldn't catch up. Eventually, we made it back to the aquarium's main road. We didn't stop running until the familiar glass walls of the lobby came into view. Miraculously, we slipped back into our group without anyone noticing. Mr. Russo was still chatting with another teacher, oblivious. Ethan and I never told a soul what happened. At the time, we thought keeping quiet was the smartest move, avoiding trouble, sparing ourselves from questions we couldn't answer. But as we grew older, we talked about it less and less. Sometimes I lay awake at night, thinking about the man's face, his voice, the knife clattering on the road. We can guess what his intentions were, but we'll never know for sure. And honestly, I don't want to. When I was in 8th grade, all of us looked forward to our school's big Washington, D.C. field trip. For months, we've been buzzing about it. The thrill of going anywhere with your friends for a few days was enough to keep us excited. After endless preparations, packing lists, and teacher reminders, the day finally came. When we arrived in D.C., our group of nearly 100 students was split into 3 smaller groups, each assigned a coach bus and chaperones. Within those groups, we were also divided further into hotel room assignments. We spent the weekend visiting museums, monuments, parks, and even took short trips to nearby states. By the end of it, we were tired but exhilarated. To finish the trip on a fun note, our teacher surprised us with something different, a colonial ghost tour. The ghost tour took place one evening as the sun set, bathing the streets in a soft orange glow. It was a walking tour through one of America's older cities, not in D.C. itself, but somewhere nearby. I can't remember the exact name of the city now, but I vividly recall how the streets felt. Narrow, lined with centuries-old homes and uneven brick sidewalks that seemed to whisper history. Our group split into smaller teams of 10, each with its own tour guide. They gave us small cameras if we wanted them, saying we might catch something strange in our photos. But the guides also warned us not to expect much. Most of the time, nothing happens, one said with a shrug. I wasn't a big fan of ghost stories back then. They scared me too easily, and I reassured myself over and over that nothing real would happen on our tour. My friend Jessica, who shared a hotel room with me during the trip, wasn't much for ghost hunting either. She wasn't one of those kids snapping photos constantly like some others in our group. Instead, she kept her camera in her pocket most of the time, only taking the occasional photo while mostly listening to the guide's stories. Our group eventually stopped in front of a small 2-story house. It sat alone at a corner, its windows giving off an eerie bluish tint under the streetlights. The house looked old, so old it seemed like even breathing near it might make it crumble. The guide gathered us around and began telling its story. The house, she said, once belonged to a man and his beautiful young wife. They were a happy couple, or so it seemed, and they were overjoyed to learn that they were expecting their first child. But tragedy struck. The wife died, giving birth to a baby girl, leaving the man shattered and hollow. The guide's voice grew softer as she explained how the man, unable to cope with his grief, began to resent his daughter. To him, she was a constant reminder of what he had lost. As the girl grew up, he kept her hidden in the house, away from the world. He criticized her constantly, calling her plain and unworthy. And because he thought she would never marry, he forced her to spend her days sewing and weaving upstairs, her only useful talents, he said. Listening to the story, I felt an ache in my chest for the girl who had lived and died in that house. Jessica must have felt the same because she took her camera out and snapped a single photo of the house before we walked on to the next stop. We were almost to the next house when Jessica suddenly stopped in her tracks. She didn't say a word, just stared down at her camera screen. "Jess, what is it?" I asked nervously. She didn't answer right away. When I leaned over to look, my stomach flipped. There on the screen was the photo of the house. At first, it looked normal, but then I noticed something glinting near one of the upstairs windows on the right side. "Zoom in," I whispered. She did. As the image grew larger, my breath caught. There, clear as day, were three distinct figures staring out of the second-floor window. On the far right was the faint, translucent outline of a woman. Behind her stood a tall man, his figure shadowy but unmistakable. And to the left, there was a third figure. A woman again, but this one was harder to make out. Her body was visible, but her features blurred as though the glass itself was resisting her form. Jessica and I stared at the screen, frozen. The man and the daughter. "That makes sense," I murmured. "But who's the other woman?" I raised my hand and called out to the guide. Was there ever anyone else who lived in that house? With a family? The guide stopped walking and turned to me, her brow furrowed in surprise. "Yes," she said after a pause. "During their time there, the family employed a servant, a young black woman who lived with them until her death." Jessica and I didn't say anything else. We just kept walking, sticking closer to the group than before. And for the rest of the night, we didn't take any more pictures. Even now, years later, I can still see those three figures staring out from that window. And every so often, I wonder if they're still waiting for someone to notice them. It was senior year of high school when my forensics teacher, Mr. Carter, somehow convinced the school to let him take us on a field trip to an abandoned building deep in the woods. He told the administration it was tied to our unit on crime scenes and forensic science. I think he might have bent the truth a little. Maybe he made it sound like we'd only be studying the perimeter and documenting the outside. But in reality, we went much deeper than that. The building itself had once been a drug den. When we pulled up, I couldn't believe how eerie and unsettling it looked in person. It was massive, crumbling, and completely surrounded by thick woods in every direction. The narrow road leading up to it was overgrown with grass and weeds, the kind of road you'd never drive down unless you were deliberately looking for trouble. Since our class was studying the effects of drugs on communities, Mr. Carter decided this would be the perfect real-world example. He let us inside the abandoned building like he'd done it 100 times before. And honestly, it felt like he had. He seemed to know so much about the place, its history, its former use, and even the darker events that had happened within those walls. Apparently, the building's original purpose was never fully clear. Construction on the upper levels had stopped halfway through before the place was abandoned altogether. Its remote location made it the perfect place for shady deals and other illegal activity. It was bizarre thinking about how we were inside this former drug haven as part of a school-sanctioned field trip. Mr. Carter was so laid back during the tour that he didn't even notice when a couple of students wandered off to explore on their own, or maybe he just didn't care. Seeing that, my friend Mia and I decided to break off from the group too. For context, I'm a guy, and Mia was one of my closest friends back in high school. She wasn't too eager about going off alone, but I convinced her anyway. From the outside, the building looked like it had at least 8 floors. The top few looked unfinished and unstable, but I still wanted to climb as high as we could. Worst case, if we lose the group, we could just head back to the bus, I told her with a grin. We started climbing the stairs, one creaking flight after another. At first, the middle floors didn't look so bad. There was less graffiti, less trash, and the air felt strangely still. But as we climbed higher, the vibe shifted. The upper floors were littered with broken glass, old beer bottles, and strange symbols spray-painted on the walls. When we finally reached what seemed to be the second highest floor, I noticed the foundation was still just exposed wood. Most of it was rotting, and there were holes big enough to fall through if we weren't careful. We would have tried to reach the very top floor, but the stairs leading up had been completely destroyed. There was nothing left but a gaping hole where steps used to be. Still, something about that last floor pulled at me. As Mia and I carefully walked across the weak wooden boards, she suddenly grabbed my shoulder and froze. "Wait," she whispered, pointing up. I followed her gaze to a hole in the ceiling above us. And that's when we heard it. A faint clicking noise, like the sound someone makes when calling a cat. Then, out of the darkness, an arm appeared, dangling down into the hole. Just an arm. The sleeve was long and black, covering most of it, leaving only pale fingers exposed. Judging by how it was positioned, whoever it belonged to had to be lying flat on the floor above us, just out of sight. At first, I laughed nervously. "Probably just some other kid from class messing with us," I muttered. But Mia wasn't laughing. Her face had gone pale, and I could feel her hand trembling on my shoulder. "Let's go," she said firmly. Still curious, I called up toward the figure. "Hey, where do we get up there?" There was no reply. Instead, the hand waved slightly, still making that unnerving, clicking sound. Something about it felt wrong, deeply wrong. That's when Mia tugged my arm harder. "We're leaving. Now!" I nodded, and as we turned to leave, the figure above us suddenly pulled its arm back. We heard the sound of shoes scraping against the floorboards above, fast, deliberate movement. "They're getting up." "Mia," he said. Fear shot through me. We started moving toward the stairwell corridor when a loud crash echoed from the opposite side of the room. We spun around. On the far end of the room stood a man. He wasn't part of our class. He wasn't even dressed like someone out on an urban exploration trip. His clothes were ragged, his posture stiff and unnatural. He was facing the wall at first, but then, without moving his body, he snapped his head to look directly at us. His stare was sharp, unblinking, and ice cold. Mia and I bolted. We sprinted down the stairs as fast as we could, not daring to look back. 3 flights down, I risked glancing up the stairwell, and there he was. The man was standing at the top of the stairs, staring straight down at us. "Go! Just go!" I shouted at Mia. We kept running, our footsteps echoing through the hollow building. Another 5 flights later, I looked back again. He was still there. Closer now. I could hear the sound of his boots striking the floor above as he descended after us. Panic clawed at my chest as we finally reached the ground floor. We burst out of the stairwell, gasping for breath. Ahead, I heard Mr. Carter's voice calling the group together. Relief washed over me so fast I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe we'd made it out. Mia didn't laugh, though. She was trembling, eyes wide with fear. When we found Mr. Carter, he scolded us for wandering off, but grew quiet as we told him what had happened. His face darkened. He didn't argue when we suggested leaving. Soon after, the rest of the students regrouped, and we all filed back onto the bus. Mr. Carter did a head count 3 times before we pulled away. For most of the students, the field trip was just an educational day out. They learned about the dangers of drugs and got a glimpse of real-world forensic science. But for Mia and me, it was something else entirely. To this day, it remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life.